As the Melbourne Declaration states, Australian education aims to produce students who are successful learners, confident and creative individuals, and active and informed citizens. To do this, our students need to be able to communicate effectively, and as the Australian curriculum states, effective communication in Australia usually requires a proficiency with Standard Australian English. As the 2016 census showed, Australia is continuing to expand as a culturally and linguistically diverse nation. For many of the students in our classrooms, English is not their first language. Only 73% of Australians speak English as their first language. For the other 27% of Australians, languages such as Mandarin, Arabic, Cantonese, and Vietnamese are their first language. Students who speak these languages would account for many of our EALD students. We need to employ strategies such as explicit language instruction to help these students effectively communicate in Standard Australian English. The Australian curriculum, as well as other research, states that explicit language instruction is vital for effective teaching of English language learners. We, as teachers of English, need to ensure that we're making adjustments for our EALD learners to explicitly teach them the English skills they need to succeed. But you might be thinking, I've heard the term explicit language instruction, but what does that mean? And how do I do it? This module will help you to develop your skills in this area by looking at ways to teach key terminology, content, and give feedback in a useful way. Before we jump into this though, I thought it was worth stating that the strategies which benefit EALD learners will often also benefit other learners in your English classes because they're about really breaking down language and how to effectively use it. Explicit teaching key terminology or essential vocabulary is vital when teaching EALD learners. This may seem like common sense. If they don't understand the relevant key terms, how will they understand the key concepts? But often, key terminology can fall under the umbrella of assumed knowledge and is therefore not given adequate teaching time. Let's assume that you are teaching a unit on poetry in the middle years. Some of the key terminology students would need to know include metaphor, allegory, and symbolism. To help students to understand these terms, it is worth spending class time defining and identifying examples. A Freya model is a great way to help students thoroughly understand key terms. You could also incorporate defining essential vocab into a warm-up or homework activities. Students could write 3 interesting metaphors for homework or form groups to write a short poem which includes certain devices. Another useful activity is for students to make their own glossary of terms which can be updated throughout the unit. To support EALD learners, and indeed most learners, explicit instruction of key vocabulary should be included in every unit. For example, academic language should be taught when writing essays, and speaking conventions taught when doing oral presentations. A hypothetical poetry unit was mentioned earlier. Look at your study guide. Activity 1 asks you to think of some of the key vocabulary students would need to know for certain assessment pieces. Pause the video on this slide and complete the activity. Having an understanding of essential vocabulary also needs to be learnt in context. In other words, you have to relate the vocab to the content. As Newman states, the more you know about a subject, the easier it is to read about it and understand it. Explicitly teaching content and building background knowledge is an essential part of students having a thorough understanding of the language used. The key strategy here is making connections between the essential vocabulary and other words in the text, with students' background knowledge and personal experience. By doing this, the teacher is making it clear how those words embedded in the text relate to bigger, potentially more familiar concepts. You can do this just by asking questions, which require students to clarify content or make connections. Making connections between vocab, content, and personal or background knowledge can be done very simply, but makes the connections explicit to EALD learners, and again will also benefit other learners. The final area of explicit language instruction that we will quickly cover involves giving feedback. Freeman states that there are 2 ways to give feedback: recast feedback and elicitations. Recast feedback involves identifying what is wrong with student work and rewriting or fixing it for them. The problem here is that students are left to make the jump from their work to the teacher work on their own. Elicitations involve the teacher identifying issues but leaving the student to make the changes. Explicitly state why they need to change it, but don't do it for them. This way the student is supported to make changes but needs to go through the process of making improvements on their own. Freeman states that this is a much more beneficial way of providing feedback for EALD learners. In conclusion, explicit language instruction is so important for EALD learners. We can do this by explicitly teaching essential vocab, relating it to content and students' prior knowledge, and giving explicit feedback. As teachers, we need to support our students to develop English language skills so that they can effectively communicate in standard Australian English.